位现场的嘉宾以及线上观看直播的观众朋友们，大家好，大家午安。我是今天的主持人陆怡珍，非常开心看到今天大家来参与今天的活动。今天是由余国华文教基金会主办，风传媒以及 International Peace Foundation 共同主办 ，TSMC 台积电以及 Bridges 协办的诺贝尔经济学奖得主 Joseph Stiglitz 的演讲。Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to all the guests joining us here in person and also online. For today's event, a lecture by Nobel Laureate in Economics, Joseph Stiglitz. This event is organized by Kuo Huang Yu Foundation, co-organized by the Storm Media Group, and International Peace Foundation, and supported by TSMC and Bridges. 那么今天活动一开始呢，首先允许我可以介绍一下今天与会的嘉宾，非常的重要。那点到您的名字的时候呢，邀请您可以起身，然后面对我们的观众，还有线上的朋友，或许挥挥手致意，让大家可以更认识您。We're very honored to have you here with us today. So to begin, we would like to introduce our speakers and distinguished guests. When your name is called upon, please stand up and perhaps turn toward the audience and give us a wave. First, it's my honor to introduce Nobel Laureate of Economics, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Welcome. So good to see you here in Taiwan, Professor. 紧接着介绍我们今天的对谈讲者，欢迎中研院经济研究所研究员兼副所长杨淑俊，欢迎你。同样也是我们今天的对谈讲者，欢迎台湾师范大学的副校长应永祥副校长。紧接着介绍我们的主办单位 organizer 余国华文教基金会张孝伟董事长，欢迎你。以及介绍我们今天的共同主办单位风传媒集团创办人张果军董事长 ，welcome。And also welcome International Peace Foundation Chairman Mr. Wen Morawetz. Welcome. 那因为今天的开场非常的别开生面，而且非常的重要，所以一开始呢，我想邀请所有的贵宾可以一起来到讲台前，我们先进行一个开场的大合照。Now I would like to invite all our distinguished guests to come onto the stage for a group photo. Take your time, no worries. 当然，我也可以再次慢慢的介绍即将来到讲台前的我们今天的重要的贵宾 ，Professor Joseph Stiglitz， 中研院经济研究所研究员兼副所长杨淑俊，以及台湾师范大学副校长应永祥，以及余国华文教基金会张孝威董事长，风传媒集团创办人张果军董事长。International Peace Foundation Chairman Mr. Wen Morawetz. Thank you so much. Please look in front of the camera. 也请现场所有的嘉宾，如果方便的话，也可以拿起您的手机记录起这个非常重要的时刻，特别是属于诺贝尔经济学奖得主 Professor Joseph Stiglitz 来到台湾。对我们的演讲。Thank you so much for our guests. Please now return to your seats. Thank you so much. 但是特别我想请张孝威董事长邀请您留步，因为呢，在我们一开始开场致辞的时候呢，特别希望可以邀请张孝威董事长为我们今天的特别的活动可以讲几句话。有请。
Professor Stiglitz, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce the Professor Stiglitz, who is economic thinker, leader in the economic thinker that of our modern time. As you know, Professor Stiglitz is a Nobel Laureate and a professor at Columbia University. That Professor Stiglitz spent his lifetime dismantling the myths of true freedom. From his early stage of work, that his pioneering work on information, on economics, which in 2001 earned him the Nobel Prize, and then later on, his leadership as a chief economist at the World Bank. He has done huge amount of work that inspiring the world, that the rising inequality is not just a natural course of market-driven activities, but a result of the policy choices. In today's speech, the Professor Stiglitz, that he's going to talk about his new work, which is his new book, The Road to Freedom and Economics and the Good Society. He challenges the long-held neoliberal view that the free market is the best path to prosperity and individual freedom. Instead, he argues that the free market, the so-called free market, true freedom, often that deprive the freedom of many people, instead put the wealth and the resources that in the hands of a few. And he thinks that what the government should do is to redefine the definition of true freedom so that all people that will be able to enjoy equal economic opportunity, justice, and the social welfare. His vision of progressive capitalism aiming at reducing inequality and promoting a good society has really enlightened myself. And I believe that his thoughts that will bring a significant impact to governments around the world in the coming decade. Now, please join me now to welcome Professor Stiglitz.
好，谢谢张乔伟董事长，邀请您先行回座。那接下来呢，就是大家万众瞩目的重量级的主讲了，是由 Joseph Stiglitz 教授所带来的。那接下来让我花一点点的时间，可以再好好详细介绍一下 Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Joseph Stiglitz is the founder of Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University in New York, who was awarded in 2001 Nobel Prize for Economics for his analysis of markets, of asymmetry information, in particular the insurance market. Professor, for today's event, I've watched so many of your talks criticizing Trump's policy. They're so sharp, they're so insightful, and as a journalist, I think most importantly, they're so easily understandable by the general public. I think that's so important. That's the reason why we gather here today. And also, that reminds me, Professor, you were once the chairman of President Bill Clinton's Council Economic Advisors before becoming a chief economist at the World Bank. And Professor right now is a co-chair of high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD and the chief economist at the Roosevelt Institute. Without further ado, Professor, thank you so much for coming here to Taiwan, and we can't wait for your keynote speech. 我们掌声欢迎教授。
Well, let me say what it's a pleasure to be here in Taiwan again. It's only been 35 years since I last visited, and there have been a few changes since then. But I'm sorry that it's been so long, but I hope to be back soon again. And I want to thank the Bridges, the International Peace Foundation, for having brought me here, and the foundations and the partnerships that have enabled me to come for this lecture. The discussions of the topics that I'm going to be talking about have been moved very much front and center in the political debates in many countries around the world. I began writing this book about 5 years ago, when there was the pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there were a lot of debates about the notions of freedom. Many on the right, for instance, during the pandemic, resisted the mask requirements and the vaccination requirements that proved to be so helpful here in Taiwan in keeping down the pandemic. But in the United States, particularly in what we call the red states, they resisted that, and the disease became really very, very serious. And the argument they gave for resisting is it was taking away their freedom. And I'll make some comments about that, but they use that language on freedom. And particularly among the Silicon Valley moguls, there's a lot of growth in libertarianism, a kind of lack of trust in government and collective action. And now Trump is trampling on the rule of law, both domestically, which we experienced in our universities. My own university, academic freedom is really being attacked, but also internationally, like the attack on Venezuela, and really undermining some of the basic principles of human rights. Maybe as a footnote, I should say that when I wrote the book, it was and published it, and the publisher was fantastic, got the book out very quickly, because I wanted the book to affect the election campaign of Harris versus Trump, because I thought it would make a very big difference. Not my book, but I thought the outcome of the election would make a big difference, and I was right that the outcome, I didn't think we fully understood how important that election was. I thought just talking about economics was not enough, that one needed to have a political discourse about freedom. Kamala Harris adopted a lot of the ideas. I don't know if any of you followed the American election, but among her songs was Beyonce's Freedom was one of her campaign songs. So this became a theme for a while, but as all of you know, it wasn't enough. Harris lost the election. My book was not enough. It didn't stop what happened, partly because a whole set of other issues like immigration turned out to be, and a lot of mis and disinformation turned out to be far more important than the ideas. But the ideas are really important, and they've become more important since then. Now, a lot of people might be surprised of how is it that an economist is talking about freedom? Isn't that a subject that philosophers or maybe political scientists ought to be talking about? But actually, there's a long history of economists talking about the notion of liberty and freedom. There's a famous book by John Stuart Mill in the middle or early part of the 19th century called On Liberty. And then in the middle of the last century, two famous economists, both of whom got the Nobel Prize. I won't comment on whether they should, but two of them wrote books that were clearly about freedom. Milton Friedman, some of you know, the dominating economist at the University of Chicago, wrote a book called Capitalism and Freedom and a book called Free to Choose. And Friedrich Hayek wrote a book, The Road to Serfdom. And you might catch my book, The Road to Freedom, is a riff off of Hayek's book. Hayek argued, he wrote his book in 1944 in the context of the aftermath of Keynesian economics, the Great Depression, when 1 out of 4 or 5 people were unemployed. Capitalism wasn't working very well. Keynes pointed out that government intervention would enable the economy to recover quicker from the Great Depression. And then in Sweden, the other Nordic countries, and in the UK where Friedrich Hayek was teaching at LSE at the time, there was a beginning of what we call today the welfare state. The UK was talking about public provision of health care. It was a radical idea at the time. And Hayek really didn't like the increased role of government. And so he wrote the book saying that if you have government trying to make sure that there's full employment, if you have government trying to make sure that everybody lives through health care, you were setting the world on the road to serfdom, to the road to authoritarianism. Now, part of the point of my book is to say that Hayek was 180 degrees wrong. He couldn't have been more wrong. That, and I'll come to this, I'll repeat this a little bit later, that in fact you see authoritarian populism more, not exclusively, but more in countries where governments haven't done enough, where there's disillusionment, despair, than you do in countries like in Scandinavia, where governments have done a lot to protect people. And one of the subtext of my book is that this extreme libertarianism, neoliberalism, has actually set us on the road to fascism. And unfortunately, what I predicted in that book and one of my earlier books is where the US is going today. So the claim of Hayek and freedom, they made 3 strong claims. The first was that free markets and free enterprise were the best way to promote economic well-being and individual freedom, that there were moral justifications behind market-driven inequalities. It was sometimes called the theory of just deserts, and that economic freedom is essential, necessary for maintaining political freedom. And what I'm going to do today is to dispute each of those claims. I want to begin by pointing out that terms like free markets and free enterprise are actually terms that are used to bias the discussion. But language is really important, and this kind of language is embedding propaganda without our even knowing it. That what they should be talking is private markets and private enterprise. But using the word free, who could be against freedom? So by putting the word free enterprise together, they try to make it seem as if you're doing anything to restrict them is taking away their freedom. And I'll try to argue why that's a wrong way of thinking about it. But I just want to highlight the importance of language here and how subtly they were engaged in propaganda without, the economic students don't even realize that they are part of a propaganda machine. My work and the work of others are reflecting advances in economic theory and experiences. And over the last 40 years, neoliberalism has been shown to be wrong. What I'm going to try to argue is there are alternative economic frameworks that do a better job enhancing individual freedom, political freedom, and societal well-being. And so part of this talk is to try to go back and discuss what we mean by freedom. So the outline of my talk is going to have two parts. The first part is the meaning of freedom and liberty at a fairly abstract level. And then I'm going to try very briefly to outline what I think of would be a set of economic, political arrangements that do a better job at advancing well-being, including the notions of freedom. So in the first part, when I'm talking about what are the basic concepts, I want to divide that into three parts. The first is a question of definition. What do we mean by freedom? And here the critical issue is the way economists tend to think about things. It's the freedom of what you can do. We would say technically your opportunity set. And if you expand your opportunity set, what you can do, you're expanding your freedom. There's some subtleties in that, but that's the basic idea. The second is anybody who studied economics knows economists love to talk about trade-offs. And what I'm going to do is talk about the pervasiveness of trade-offs. And here the idea is that one person's freedom may be another person's unfreedom. It's taking away, comes in at the cost of another person's freedom. And finally, the hardest idea is that in fact, a little bit of coercion, which we think of as antithetical to freedom, a little bit of coercion can enhance the freedom of all, or at least most individuals in a more meaningful way. So let me begin with the broad perspective on the meaning of freedom. And as I said, liberty is about a person's freedom to act. And expanding what you can do, your opportunity set, expanding the set of options that are available is effectively expanding your freedom. And contrary, any reduction in the scope of that actions can be undertaken is in the sense a loss of freedom. And here is a point that's not very subtle, is that an individual who is at the point of starvation really doesn't have any freedom. He does what he has to do just to survive. And that's really an important point to understand, that you know, you say, well, he can do whatever he wants. Well, if your choices are surviving or not, you don't really have any choice. So this approach emphasizes both the existence of positive freedoms, what you can do, but also negative, taking away those freedoms, okay? So on the right, there's been a lot more emphasis on restraints, things that might narrow or constrain the opportunity set of individuals, and especially actions that the government might take that restrain individuals. But what I'm arguing here and in my book is that's too narrow of a vision. There are constraints on our actions that come not just from the government, but from our position in society, from what others can do to you. For instance, constraints that are imposed by those who might exploit you. And government has an important role to play, both in expanding your opportunity set, that's the positive side, for instance, through public expenditures on education and health, but also in constraining others' ability to constrain your freedom. So others can take actions that can take away your freedom, and collectively, government has an important role in stopping them from restricting your freedom. And so here is the important point that for any society to function well, there have to be regulations and collective action to constrain others from constraining your freedom. So we don't think about it this way usually, but the Ten Commandments are a set of regulations. You know, in the spirit today, people say we don't like regulations. But everybody believes in the Ten Commandments. If you grow up in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and I'm sure most of you know about those Ten Commandments, things like, thou shalt not steal. Well, that takes away the freedom of the thief. But by taking away the freedom of the thief, it's a regulation, it gives society much more freedom. You can make an investment and somebody's not going to take it away from you. So the Ten Commandments is a set of regulations. If you say, I don't like regulations, that means I want to get rid of the Ten Commandments. Nobody really believes that. The real question in our society is, how do we design the right set of regulations to expand the freedom of the most people? What are the good regulations that stop bad behavior? And how do we arrive at a collective decision about that? Now, obviously, in a modern society, we need more than 10 regulations. You need a complex set of regulations. And as the world gets more complex, we need more. Every new change, like financial market complexity, AI, social media, are going to require a new set of regulations. How are we going to make sure that these potential innovations that can make us all better off actually make us better off and don't result in a worse society? So that's the big challenge. So that's the basic concept that I have in mind in talking about freedom. Now, the second one is that trade-offs are ubiquitous. And I said, I put it, one person's freedom can be another person's unfreedom. The famous philosopher at Oxford, Isaiah Berlin, at All Souls College, put it much more poetically. Economists are not very poetic. He put it, freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep. So getting rid of regulations about the wolves, letting them out there in the wild, has meant the sheep don't do very well. And economists refer to these problems as externalities. They are pervasive, they are ubiquitous, and they're both positive and negative. And they are become especially important as we become a more urbanized society, as we push against our planetary boundaries, the externalities associated with climate change. And there are positive externalities in the innovation economy. Discoveries by one person can benefit all of society. But here, what I want to emphasize is the conflicts of freedom. And I mentioned at the beginning that one of the motivations for writing this book was what happened during the pandemic, where some of the Republicans and the right-wing states said, we don't want to wear masks, we don't want to get vaccinated. And that's taking away our freedom. But the argument that I put forward was that, yes, it is taking away your freedom, but if you don't wear a mask and you don't get vaccinated, COVID-19 is going to spread around society. More people are going to get the disease. More people are going to get hospitalized. More people are going to die. And then society has to make a balance. Which is more important? Your loss of freedom to wear a mask or their loss of freedom to live? And to me, it was so obvious. The right to live is a more important freedom than the right not to wear a mask. And well-functioning societies like Taiwan made the right decision. But unfortunately, in the United States, there was not that collective awareness to make the right decision. And it cost a lot of people. We lost over 1 million lives in the United States as a result of that. That's a big deal. Also on the right, there are some people say it's a basic right, is the right to carry a gun. And some of you who visit some of the states in the United States like Texas may be surprised. You walk into a store like Walmart and people are walking around carrying guns. And you know, most of us feel a little bit nervous. It's not just a little pistol, they're carrying around a machine gun. And you know, they say it's a basic human right to carry an AK-47 wherever I want to go. And to tell me I can't carry an AK-47 is infringing my basic human right. But as many of you know, almost every day in the United States there's a mass murder. And children in our schools, you know, when I was a kid, we had to learn what to do if there was a nuclear attack. It's hard to remember, but that was what, when I grew up, that's what we were worried about. And so we learned how to go to the air raid shelters and, you know, what to do if there was a nuclear attack. Today, in the United States, all across the country, children in kindergarten, first grade have to learn what to do when a gunman comes into the classroom. And parents worry about whether their children are going to come home safe. One of our great presidents, and it's not the most current one, it's not one of our great presidents, but one of our great presidents was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he gave a speech where he talked about the 4 freedoms. And one of the freedoms that he emphasized was the freedom from fear. And the right to carry around an AK-47 has meant that every parent with kids has lost this freedom from fear. Everybody now has this fear of what will happen if somebody walks into a public space and starts shooting. So there again, there's trade-offs, but I think every civilized society would come to the same decision. The right to live is more important than the right to carry around an AK-47. But one has to make that decision. And as I say, I feel very strongly that every society would probably come to the same decision. Another example of these trade-offs is the right to pollute. The US president believes it's the right of everybody to put as much carbon into the atmosphere, to pollute as much as you want. Stopping that as regulation is taking away your freedom. And he says, drill, baby, drill. Let's create let's get as much global warming as we can, as fast as we can. So that right to pollute is taking away the rest of ours right to live a natural life. If you have asthma, it means you lose the right to live. So again, I think every civilized society will come to the same decisions. As I said, in each of these cases, society has to make judgments, and most would agree on how these liberties should be balanced. But I want to make it clear, and probably in our discussion we'll talk about that, There are a lot of cases that are more difficult. I've picked the easiest ones, but there are a lot of cases where making those trade-offs are going to be more difficult. You need a societal discussions. Another area, though, where I think the answer is pretty clear is this balance between the right to exploit and freedom. So there are many forms of exploitation. We don't use that word that much, but market power, if you have the power to raise prices, that taking advantage of somebody else in a way that would not be true in a competitive market, taking advantage of scams that give mis and disinformation, trying to take money by dishonesty. So there are many forms. You know, I hate, you may have picked up that Trump is an obsession with many Americans. And so I'll make a lot of reference to that, but that is where we are. One of Trump's earlier achievements was Trump University. And Trump University didn't deliver education, it delivered exploitation. It took advantage of people's aspirations to do better. And before Trump became president, he had to pay millions of dollars in fines on Trump University for the exploitation. So the question is, would a good society have regulations to prevent exploitation? And in any of these forms, exploitation of market power, exploitation of vulnerabilities, exploitation of asymmetries of information is one of the things I wrote about very early on. And again, I think in balancing, I think most of us would agree that the right to exploit is not as important as the right not to be exploited. And so we need regulations to stop that kind of exploitation. A society functions better with those kinds of regulations. So there's a broad consensus that exploitation should be constrained in spite of the loss of the freedom of the monopolists. And one can argue with this on both moral and efficiency grounds. An area which is more controversial is the notion of freedom and distribution. Libertarians and conservatives argue that taxation is a deprivation of liberty, of the right to spend one's money as one pleases. Taxation is a kind of coercion. It constricts the individual's budget constraining what she can do, her opportunity set. I should make a note, there is an unjustified assumption. Whatever I receive as income is justifiably mine, even if it arises from exploitation of others, or as a result of inheritance from an ancestor who engaged in such exploitation. But when we think about it, we realize that redistributive taxation and expenditure policies expand the opportunity set of others. So you constrain some and you expand others, and you have to make a balancing of the two. And again, in my judgment, if you are expanding the opportunities by providing health and education to the poor, that expansion of the opportunity set is far more important than the contraction of the set of those being taxed if you have a very progressive income tax system. Again, there are externalities associated with these inequalities. Actually, inequalities lead to poor economic performance. When I put that idea forward about a decade and a half ago in my book, The Price of Inequality, it was viewed as a little bit radical, but interestingly now view that societies marked by excessive inequalities actually perform more poorly. And even the IMF has now, which is, as you know, not a left-wing institution, agrees with my view on this, and so is the OECD. So the final idea I want to get across is that some coercion can be freeing for everyone, and that's in a way the hardest idea to get across. But a little example, I think, illustrates that. Again, there are many, just like the Ten Commandments, we don't often think of as a set of regulations, but they are. Traffic lights are a regulation. What do I mean by that? Well, traffic lights say that when it's red, you can't go. It's a regulation. It says you have to wait your turn until it's green. So in that sense, a traffic light is a form of coercion. It says if you violate that, you're going to have to pay a big fine. So it's coercion. But think about the alternative. If you didn't have traffic lights in a city like New York, you would have gridlock. Nobody could move. So nobody would have the freedom to move. So a simple regulation like traffic lights enhances, in a meaningful way, everybody's freedom. Now everybody can move. They just have to take their turn. So it's a little coercion, but it actually is freeing. Now, that's a metaphor for many things in our society. For instance, to go back to the pandemic, the reason we got over the pandemic as quickly as we did was because of the mRNA vaccine, which was very quickly developed as a result of government spending of money. But it was quickly developed because before the pandemic, the government had spent, the research at University of Pennsylvania and other places had spent a lot of money developing what was called the mRNA platform. It was basic research, but clear view of what its potential was. And the point is that research doesn't come for free. Somebody had to pay for it. But what does it mean that somebody had to pay for it? We had to have taxes. Taxes are coercion, as I said before. Taxes are coercion. So, again, it's a kind of a trade-off. A little coercion, but those taxes meant that we all had the freedom to live. We all had the freedom to be able to have meetings, interact with other people, to go back to a normal life, to go beyond COVID-19. So a little bit of coercion really did free our society. And then if we have to make a societal judgment, was it worth it? I think the answer was clearly yes. So when we start thinking through how a modern society functions, it is very clear that we are going to need, at various points, coercion to make us free. One of the things that the reality that we face today, not a very nice reality, is there are a number of people who don't believe in the rule of law. Putin invading Ukraine. Trump. They don't believe in the rule of law. And what does that mean? if Putin can invade Ukraine, the Ukrainian people and Europe more broadly needs to fight for its freedom. If they don't fight for their freedom, Russia will just walk all over them, and they won't have any freedom. But what does that mean? People have to pay taxes. And that's coercion. But which is more important, paying taxes or having your life run by Putin? To me, there's no, that's an obvious question. The answer to that question is, I want to pay taxes in order to make sure that Putin doesn't tell me what to do. So the bottom line is that the last line is coercion can enhance freedom and is necessary. There are some cases where this kind of coercion, the kind of coordination that we need for collective action can be done with very little coercion. For instance, any of you visit some very disorganized developing countries know that they haven't yet adopted a convention about whether you should drive on the left or the right side of the road. And if you don't understand which side of the road to drive in, life is very dangerous. Most societies have decided whether to drive on the left hand or on the right hand. It doesn't make a great deal of difference, but it does make a big difference that you all understand the rules. And if you say, well, I want to drive on the left side, but everybody else is driving on the right side, it's not a very good way of organizing society. So once the rules are set, they're easy to sustain. I now want to spend just a few minutes talking about some of the ideas that clearly were not in the mind when Friedman and Hayek and John Stuart Mill wrote theirs, and that's to do with modern behavioral economics. And modern behavioral economics, people like Kahneman, Tversky, Taylor, have changed our thinking, though in very complex ways. And I'll just talk about a couple of the things. One of them is that it introduces the possibility of less coercive or non-coercive ways of altering behavior. So one of the ways in which one person's freedom can affect that of others is if you litter. It's a little thing, but it's still, when you finish eating your candy, you drop the wrapping on the ground. It makes for a dirty environment, an unpleasant, ugly environment, okay? So one person is imposing costs on others. So some societies pass regulations. You aren't allowed to litter, and if you get caught littering, you pay a big fine. That's a coercion. But some societies solve the problem in a slightly different way. They teach their children not to litter. They tell their children it really is not a good thing to do. And the children come to believe that it is a good thing to behave in a social way, in a way that we call other regarding, taking into account your effects on others. Well, if enough people incorporate that into their sense of identity, of who they are, what kind of a person they are, then you don't need regulations. Or if you have regulations, nobody says regulations matter because I wouldn't do it anyway. I don't need to have a regulation not to litter because the idea of littering is such a abhorrent idea that I wouldn't do it. So this is sometimes called the process of socialization, and it's, formally economists say it's a way of internalizing the externalities so that you take those into account in your behavior. That's one aspect of how behavioral economics has changed. The important point here is, to the extent the societies are successful in internalizing externalities, you don't need regulations, and sometimes those societies may function better. The contrast, the contrary view is, and I'll come to this a little bit later in the talk, is that America's extreme libertarianism, individualism, has encouraged more selfishness and made it more difficult for our society to function. So if everybody thinks just of himself, then society has a harder time functioning. So that is really the interesting insight of modern behavioral economics, of taking into account the fact that actually we shape people. Our society shapes people, our markets shape people, and the way they shape us may change how well our society functions. The second talks about a particular instrument. The second point I want to make in behavioral economics is a particular way in which our society shapes us is through the media. The media provides information, stories, context, with the lens through which we see a lot of what is going on. And so they're it's very, very important. But if that's true, which I think it is, then who gets to control the media, control the social media, the press, gets to control, or at least shape, societal meta-narratives? And that effectively takes away the freedom, their freedom to shape that is taking away the freedom of the rest of our society. So the problem in too many societies is that the control of the media has been put in the hands of a few very wealthy people. In the United States, it's Murdoch, Fox News, Wall Street Journal. You have Meta controlled by Zuckerberg, X controlled by Musk. So you have an enormous concentration of media and social media power. And their decisions about what you see is shaping how we see the world. And the question is that what a good society would want? Would we want to delegate that much power to those individuals? And I think the answer is no. I think it's really important to begin to think about democratizing our information ecosystem and improving our information ecosystem. And this really takes me back to the kind of ideas that were, I started writing about 50 years ago and were the basis of my Nobel Prize, but in a new context with AI and social media, which weren't there 50 years ago when I did my earlier work. And what is clear in some of my most recent research talks about the fact that markets on their own will result in a suboptimal information ecosystem. There will be insufficient investment in quality information, excessive production of dis and misinformation. And so that raises some really difficult issues about what regulations should be imposed on the media, including the social media, to prevent or at least reduce the social harms. Things like restrictions that affect virality, of mis and disinformation, like anti-vax during the pandemic. Difficult problems of who it is to judge, but in some cases, like the anti-vax, it was relatively easy. But I think for any society to function well, there has to be some way of assessing truth. You know, there isn't, it's just not everything can go. And a second important, I think really important aspect for the creating a good information ecosystem, which I think is necessary for a well-functioning society, is that one has to force AI and social media to compensate the legacy media for the intellectual property that they, I use the word steal here. They don't like to use me to use that word steal. That's a word that has clear connotations that I don't approve of it. But with that is what AI and the social media have been doing, stealing intellectual property from the producers of the legacy media, the people who are gathering, and that is takes away their incentive, and the net effect of all of that is going to be a lower quality information ecosystem. So in all of these cases, there are trade-offs, there are no absolutes, but I suspect that constructing the good society would entail more regulations on mis and disinformation, more regulations on dangerous virality, and the less ability of the wealthy to dominate the shaping of beliefs and preferences. So now let me come to the second part of my talk, having tried to elaborate on how I think about the notion of freedom, is what kind of an economic and political system delivers freedom and more broadly well-being. And I'm going to go through this hopefully fairly quickly. The first is the failure of neoliberalism and why neoliberalism did not expand freedom. I should say, you know, the name neoliberalism was all about freedom. Liberal is free. Neo was trying to talk about, it was new liberalism, going beyond 19th, it was 20th century, but there was really no difference between neoliberalism and old liberalism. It's just that Milton Friedman and all those guys didn't want to say, I'm an old liberal. They wanted to say, I'm new. So they had to invent a new word, and that was neoliberalism. But it didn't work. So that's the first point I want to make. I'm going to then describe progressive capitalism as an alternative, and then I want to spend a few minutes talking about why all of this is so important, putting it in a historical perspective. So, so first on the failure of neoliberalism, what it meant? It meant freeing the economy, stripping away regulations, reducing the size of the state, giving full rein to unfettered markets. The belief was it would lead to higher growth, trickle-down economics ensured that benefits would be shared by all, and that the freedom of all, economic and political freedom, would be enhanced. I think, you know, you can say that this began around 40 years ago, 45 years ago, in Thatcher and Reagan politically, Milton Friedman. It's a long time to have an experiment, and it was a terrible failure. Actually, the era of neoliberalism, growth was cut by 1/2, 2/3, and all the benefits of growth went to those at the top. So the only thing that it really achieved was more inequality. And as I said in the beginning, it has really set us on the road to fascism, to authoritarian populism that we see in the United States. Now, in my book, I argue that it's not even a sustainable institutional arrangement. It's not environmentally, socially, politically, or economically sustainable. It leads to monopolies, which undermine the basis of a market economy, which is competition. It leads to the kind of social divides that we can trust. Without trust, the market economy can't function. It encourages traits of selfishness, dishonesty, for which Trump is emblematic. And in that sense, I think neoliberalism creates a kind of capitalism that will devour itself. And these kinds of unfettered markets are not efficient, not stable. That's really been at the center of a lot of my own research. So let me just very boldly state, Friedman and Hayek were both wrong. Okay, and if we have more time, come back. But I want to. I'm sure any question we can come talk about it more. But I want to go to the second question: what kind of society is most likely to enhance the freedoms of most citizens? This is where the idea that I put forward of progressive capitalism is important. I don't like the term progressive capitalism. I didn't know what word to use. I want to emphasize that markets, private enterprise is an important part, but it's not the only part. There's collective action, and collective action is not just governments. It's also other kinds of social arrangements, churches, cooperatives, people, labor unions, people getting together for one purpose or another. That's a collective action. NGOs, not-for-profits, foundations, like the one that's sponsoring my talk today, they play a very important role in our society. You know, if you look at the education system, America used to have a great university system until Trump started to attack it. Every one of our great universities is either a state university, like University of California, Berkeley, UCLA, or a not-for-profit foundation, like Columbia, Princeton, Chicago, Yale. There's no for-profit institution that is a good university in America. Now, in some other countries there are some. I don't want to say it's not possible, but in the United States, all the great universities are either public or not-for-profits. And it's created a good education system. And I give this to emphasize there are many institutional arrangements. And sometimes we dichotomize and say it's either government or the private sector. But there are actually many different kinds, you know, private for-profit. So there are many ways of organizing society. And one of the things that we ought to be thinking about is how do we design better institutions that reflect what was good. Just to give you one example of concern, you know, a lot of the deaths during the pandemic were in old age homes. And they were in for-profit old age homes because they put profits over lives. And when you see a hedge fund buy an old age home for people with dementia, you have to ask a question. what is the comparative advantage of a hedge fund in running an old age home? What do they know about old age homes that people in the healthcare sector don't know? What they know about is exploitation, taking advantage of others. And I feel much more comfortable when I get old going to an old age home run by the Quakers or by a religious group or, somebody who's not trying to take advantage, making profits off of me, who has a social purpose. So there is in all of this an important role for government. Limiting others' exploitation, ensuring competition, providing social insurance, better risk management, socializing some risks, enabling more risk-taking, more innovation, providing, investing in public goods, dealing with externalities. So to me, that's an important part of this, what I call ecology of institutional arrangements that we ought to be working for. And one of the important aspects of this is a systems of checks and balances, making sure that there's no power concentrated in any part of the system. Because if you have power concentrated, it can be abused. And we had thought we had created in the United States a system of checks and balances, but it was a system of checks and balances that was imperfect within government and even more imperfect within our society. It is societal checks and balances that are critical. Part of, I want to come back to behavioral economics, part of my concern is trying to create a social, political, economic system that shapes individuals in a different way. As I said, the current economic system shapes individuals to be greedy, selfish, with a limited concern for others, less empathy, less honest than we might like, less concerned about democratic norms. For instance, cooperatives might shape individuals to be more cooperative, other regarding, and enhance social cohesion. And I also want to emphasize the centrality of liberal education and democratic media. Education and better understanding of the way our preferences are shaped and our actions are affected by peer pressure can be freeing. It's one of the purposes of a liberal arts education. The reason we call it a liberal education is because it is freeing. And that's the right use of the word liberal, not neoliberal. The right use of the word liberal is a liberal arts education. And the same thing, a more democratic media frees us from having our beliefs shaped by and for the interest of the wealthy. So that's where I keep coming back to the importance of, in a democratic society, avoiding concentrations of power. Because when you have those concentrations of power, there is a high chance that those powers will be abused. I really feel that academic and press freedom are an important part of those freedoms. It's part of our systems of checks and balances. We talk about press freedom, freedom of speech. We don't talk about academic freedom. But academic freedom is really one of the important checks because these are people who have the full time to think about what is the design of our society. Most people in our society have to work hard for making things work. That's the business. But we figured out in our society that we ought to have a few people think about how our society functions. It's part of designing a good system. And every corporation has people thinking about how the corporation is functioning. So that's our job. And having somebody sitting out within society, but thinking about society, outside of society, is really critical. So the last few minutes I wanted to talk about is why all of this is so important. So, the beginning of modern economics is often traced to Adam Smith, and the question is the Wealth of Nations, 1776. And the question was, why are we so much wealthier today than we were 250 years ago? If you look at history, for hundreds of years, there was no change. Standards of living didn't change for hundreds of years. Then suddenly, you see, it began around 1800. It began to increase in Europe, and other countries followed in the last 50 years in East Asia. And what was the reason for that? Well, the argument that I put forward is it has to do with a set of ideas that arose around the time of Adam Smith, a whole group of people in Scotland, France, a number of countries, called the Enlightenment. And there were several critical ideas: questioning authority, recognizing that our understanding of the world could increase, that change was possible. It was a belief in progress, that you just didn't, the world today didn't have to be what the world was in the past. It required assessing how we know the truth and how we organize society. Critical in this was the scientific method, but also critical were advances in social organization. Ideas like the rule of law, creating new institutions, independent central banks, or even central banks. These were new ideas that people started thinking about as forms of social organization. We would not be able to have the kind of modern societies that we have if we were invented these kinds of advances. So those were critical, and as I said, it led to these enormous increases, also improvements in life expectancy. It was all about a change in mindset. And this, I think, is critical for the success that we've had in the increase in our standards of living over 250 years. Critical to that are things, as I said, like the rule of law, the belief in science. And the concern as an American today is those basic principles that have been the basis of our success in economics, in our success in well-being, in our life expectancy, every dimension of our well-being are now being put in jeopardy. So let me conclude. The nearly half-century experiment with neoliberalism is coming to an end. Its failures have contributed to the growth of authoritarian and nationalist populism. It's threatening global peace and prosperity, individual freedoms, and basic human rights. An alternative world is possible, returning rather than abandoning these Enlightenment ideals. Deep scientific and rational inquiry can give us guidance about what kind of economic, political, and social system is most likely to enhance societal well-being in a sustainable way. And this idea that I put forward, this ecology, what I call progressive capitalism, rejuvenated social democracy, entailing a rich ecology of institutional arrangements an important role for collective action with public investments in education, technology, health and infrastructure, and well-designed regulations and good social protection, provides an alternative to neoliberalism. I think it will do a better job of creating what most people would say is a good society, and will set us more firmly on the road to freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you. I just want to say thank you again for your insights. I can sit there all day to listen to your keynotes, but I understand we have other panelists to share their insights as well. 我们刚刚听到，教授他花了很多的时间，从像是日常的制度啊、政治的决策，还有市场上面的机制，去举了非常多的例子，告诉我们说，其实自由并不是我们想象的一个很自然就会发生的状态，里面有非常多的折冲，而且也需要 a set of regulations， 不同的这个决策还有规范再介入影响。那这个时候，老师一再在强调的，就是说对于权力的制衡或者不要集中化，在现代无与伦比的都很重要。老师当然举了非常多美国当代的例子，在台湾没有像美国社会一样这么多分歧的议题，但是放眼望去，全世界现在也面临到了一个对于自由的抉择，什么应该保护，什么应该 trade off 的一个交叉点。那就在这样的精神之下呢，我们接下来邀请了2位。来自于台湾的当代的学者，接下来呢，我们会有一场 panel discussion。这个进行的方式是这个样子的：2位的 panelists 呢，会针对台湾的现况，各自有10分钟的时间，针对台湾跟全世界的交汇点，在我们讲的自由的经济、自由的市场、自由的政策之下，分享台湾在地的现况。然后呢，我们最后再会把这个总结再提给我们的 professor。让他针对我们台湾的现况再做出一些分享，所以谢谢我2位的这个 panelist 现在已经坐定了。那我们是不是就直接先请第1位，也就是来自于中研院经济研究所的副所长杨淑俊副所长，你的10分钟主题论述，邀请你，谢谢。
Professor Stiglitz, our moderator and distinguished guests. It's an honor to participate in this event, and in my discussion today, I would like to share a few reflections and some thoughts on how the key ideas resonate with Taiwan's experience. So the central message I got from reading the book is that the real freedom requires both well-functioning markets and strong institutions, because unrestricted capitalism can generate a rising inequality, reduce mobility and opportunities, and weakened democracy. So without shared prosperity, markets alone cannot deliver the real freedom and the broad well-being that a good society depends on. So this book revisits, but departs in important ways from Hayek's concerns that the road to serfdom, which warns that the government intervention could threaten freedom. So instead, the book argues that the unchecked markets and concentrated economic power can pose serious threats to freedom and democracy. Next. So at the core, there are 3 key ideas. The first idea is that freedom is a freedom to act, not freedom to choose. So Professor Stiglitz emphasized the concept of positive freedom, which implies that the government should really actively mobilize resources, such as taxation, to expand opportunities and provide protection. And the second idea is that when markets are not well regulated, exploitation undermines efficiency and fairness, with costs often falling on the consumers and those who are less informed. And the third idea, perhaps is a little bit surprising, is that some coercion actually can strengthen social cohesion. So modest rule-based coercion, such as the example Professor mentioned, like traffic laws and public health measures, can solve the coordination problems and build trust in society. So in other words, small constraints can generate large collective gains and therefore provide more freedom for everybody. So to address the market failure, Professor Stiglitz proposes the idea of progressive capitalism as an alternative, which balances states and markets. So market will still remain important for innovation and growth, but governments will play an important role in shaping rules and institutions. So this involves strong institutions in a variety of forms, as he mentioned, like not-for-profits, like cooperatives, and also well-designed regulations to sustain competition, and progressive taxation to finance government operations, and public investment in education, health, infrastructure as core public goods. And finally, social insurance to protect the vulnerable and to manage risks. So in my view, progressive type capitalism offers a compelling framework, but its success ultimately depends on the government capacity and how the interventions are designed and implemented. So as an economist, I fully agree that real freedom requires law and order, market intervention, and public goods provision. But at the same time, I have some concerns about appropriate scope, effectiveness, and government capacity to carry out interventions, as illustrated by recent Minnesota fraud scandal involving feeding our future. So even well-intentioned interventions aimed at feeding the poor children during the pandemic can go wrong when oversight breaks down. So in Taiwan, there are also many well-intentioned market interventions, with price control being a prominent example. So extensive and persistent price controls in key sectors, such as utilities, health, and education, are often motivated by efforts to ease the cost of living. And these measures, however, can be counterproductive if they go too far, leading to misallocation of resources, undermining market efficiency, despite their well-intentioned aims. So let me just give you a few examples. I know like price regulations in utilities are justified and common, but let me just give examples how they are implemented in Taiwan. So the state-owned power companies operates as a monopoly, but of course doesn't have pricing power. And as inflation surged during the pandemic, the government froze electricity rates, placing the company under significant financial strain and requiring direct cash injection by the government to keep the company stay afloat. So price controls often mean that the providers have to hold price steady even when production costs are rising. And just give another examples, the water prices in Taiwan have remained largely stable or remain unchanged in nominal terms more than 30 years. So that's pretty amazing. Okay. Not only utilities, so the government also get involved in other areas of price control like food. So when egg prices surged during the pandemic, the government imported eggs, but many shipments expired and were mishandled, raising concerns about program design, oversight, and transparency. So to conclude, I think Taiwan's experience reminds us that for government intervention to expand rather than constrain freedom, they must rest on sound economics, careful program design, effective and competent institutions, and clear accountability. So let me stop here, and I look forward to Professor Ying's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan Yang, Deputy Director of Institute of Economics at Sinica. Thank you. 那接下来呢，我邀请台湾师范大学的副校长应永祥副校长，请开始您的主题论述。
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. It's a privilege to read your book. And I really enjoyed your lucid and compelling writing. I would like to echo your speech and highlight a few important the highlights you already mentioned in your speech. The freedom is a complex and involves trade-off in your dimensions. And one person's freedom can restrict another's. And the true freedom must account for social and economic context. And this means balancing individuals' liberties with a collective well-being through the appropriate regulation and public policy. And we often heard of the COVID-19 crisis, the vaccinations policies, decisive decision made by Taiwanese government and save the hundreds of thousands of lives during the crisis. And also the very secure public health for people to access the accountable, tractable, affordable, accessible public health. And in your presentation, in your speech, and in the conclusions, you said neoliberalism doesn't work. Yeah, has failed to expand the real freedom for our society. And we have seen the financial deregulation and global financial crisis that happened in the past. Particularly, the vivid memory happened in year 2007 to 2009. And we also have seen the labor market flexibility, and the laborers lose their bargaining power between the employers. So this dominant liberal idea, economic model, characterized by deregulation and minimal the state intervention. So it naturally leads us to think, in your book, you talk about the government and the collective actions are essential for our freedom. The government interventions such as regulations of externalities, of course, we talk about the good side of externality, protection of public goods, and investments in education and infrastructures. And this can expand the real opportunity set for individuals. When we look at the right-hand side of the graph, this can help us to avoid the Great Gatsby curve. The parents' path is not the kid's destiny. When we see this astounding research, empirical research by the professor from City, New York, Professor Korak, he has shown us the very high positive correlation between income inequality and the intergenerational income. So your parents' income highly related to the kids' income in the future. And very surprisingly to see the United States is in a very high positive correlation side. And we often influenced by the classical economics, the markets. The market is the best solution for allocated resources, but it clearly proved the market alone cannot guarantee the good society, particularly the externality monopolies. And we haven't seen this platform dominated by the giants of such the Google or Facebook. And in your presentation, you mentioned who gives the information, who owns the media, what kind of message delivered by those giants. So how can we have the check and balance the medias to bring the clear, the justified information to our society? I think that's very important. And you give us the very powerful and the sobering message, the progressive capitalism, the government and private sectors, individual can work together and find a better way for our civil society, work together for equity, sustainability, and human flourishing. And this approach seeks to redefine freedom to include the freedom from poverty, fear, and lack of opportunities, not just freedom from regulation. And I also like to speak a few good examples about Taiwan. And also our neighboring country. I like to talk about is our health system. The accessible, affordable, tractable, affordable health care plan is not a signature remark only for Taiwan, but also we can observe it in Japan and in South Korea. And governments work with the private sectors and the talents individual in Taiwan not only can be seen in national health plan, but also we can observe the successful case for industrial technology research institution, science park. And they all involve the heavy government regulations, but also invite a lot of talents from the society. So heavy public investment in education, infrastructures, and the technology upgrading is a very successful progressive capitalism in Taiwan. And I would like to stop my moderations, but before I stop, I would like to read one few sentences I wrote for you after my reflection of reading this book. In The Road to Freedom, Professor Stiglitz challenges a deeply ingrained idea in economics and public discourse. That freedom is best understood as the absence of government intervention. Instead, he argues the real freedom must be understood as the ability of individuals live secure, dignified, and meaningful lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you for my two panelists sharing. Professor, I have tons of questions for you. I was a policy major student, graduated from this university, and the subject that I did the worst is economics. So, I have tons of questions for you. My two panelists both mentioned that freedom is a complex issue. My first question is, how do you draw a line, a hard boundary on state intervention? Because you mentioned about COVID. I'm wondering, I'm sure you're aware of, during COVID, our neighbor, Communist Party from China, they implemented a progressive method, and they can easily argue that's for the greater good. So even when a state intervened, how do you draw a line?
Well, there isn't a hard and fast line. What I try to do is talk about, there were some cases where things are easy, but many of the most interesting cases are where they're hard, and that's where you need, I think, a very strong democratic discussion and debate. And that's where it's important to have an informed debate, and that's where why academia is important and a free press is important. So you have good information in engaging in that kind of debate. Inevitably there are going to be hard cases, but let me say, responding a little bit to what Hsing said, all human institutions are going to be fallible. Shakespeare talked about, to be humanist, to be fallible, to err. So that's true of the private sector, and it's true of the public sector. And so we shouldn't be surprised if occasionally we have the kinds of things that happened in Minnesota, fraud. If we had done a better job of teaching our children to be honest, it wouldn't happen. But as hard as we try, some of us fail. I feel good about my children, but I know other people have not been as successful in making their children honest. But so it's a problem, and that's where we see institutional failure in the public sector, but we saw institutional failure in the private sector. In the 2007-8 financial crisis, if you look at, I've been involved I was very deeply involved in a lot of the litigation associated with that. And you looked inside the MBS, these mortgage-backed securities, 75% of the mortgages were fraudulent. And that was the private sector. Now, the consequence of that is not to say we're going to get rid of the private sector. The answer is we have to try to figure out why there was the failure. Let's try to correct it. So the bottom line is we're always fighting this battle to try to make our society better. We're trying to learn where we make mistakes to correct that, and there'll be some more problems that will occur. Having systems of checks and balances is absolutely crucial, because if you don't have that, the mistakes don't get corrected. Now, we corrected the mistakes in the mortgage market because we had government oversight, and we had a market competition, and people said this was not working. So there are many aspects of the systems of checks and balances, but that is a critical part. So let me put it in a very broad way. We're in a constantly evolving society, economy, where we have to constantly learn, and we figure out where things go wrong. We try to check it to make sure it won't go wrong next time, but there'll be another problem next time. And it may be in the public sector, it may be in the private sector. If we have in place strong free press, academic freedom, democratic checks and balances, we'll correct it. If we don't, it may be corrected, but it may be an awful lot of suffering before that gets corrected.
I see a lot of handwriting here. For my two panelists, you're more than welcome to jump in. Just grab your mic if you want to make comments or start a conversation. Professor, building on this question of boundaries, how should economics operationalize real freedom empirically?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I'm a theorist, so I avoid that question in general. But it's a good question, and let me say, there's no summary statistic that you can say this is our measure of freedom. To me, I tend to focus on some of the critical aspects that are sort of signals of what is going on.
Like what?
So one of them is, I said, freedom to act. What worries me are people suffering from deprivations, people who don't have education opportunities, health, jobs, so what are the people that are really suffering at the bottom, and how significant, they don't have freedom in a very meaningful sense. So that's one group. The second one is actually the Great Gatsby curve that you referred to. That's about opportunity. If you have what we call poverty traps, people who are born in the south of the United States who are poor, and particularly if they're African American, have no chance of getting out of that. We talk about America being a land of opportunity. One of the major themes in my book, The Price of Inequality, was that was a myth. It was a myth that was sold very well, and most of you bought it. But when you look at the numbers, you say empirically, there are many countries around the world where the ability to move up is much greater than in the United States. And particularly, as I say, the groups that I identified, born in the South, born in the rural area, being African American, your chances of moving up are not very good. And so that's a second dimension that I think is really important, and we can measure that. There is this very good work by this scholar Korak that has looked at at these issues, comparisons across different countries, really important. A third thing, dimension to me that is important that I mentioned is media concentration. To what extent is the media in the hands of relatively few people? To give you, again, an example, not from the United States, Italy, at one point, 6 of the 7 television stations were controlled by Berlusconi. So that, and it was so concentrated media that some of the NGOs that measure freedom said that Italy was not, were downgrading Italy because they didn't really have, in that metric, a free press. So it seems to me that that kind of media concentration, media diversity is important. Overall, a metric that I think of is that, because I think that when you have excessive wealth concentration, it will in one way or another translate into a loss of democratic values. You have power in economics, it will get translated into political power. So I also look at and that is a deprivation of freedom.
So there's a structural aspect of it, and also look out for the signals.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Look, both the consequences and the structure. Yeah.
To achieve that measurement.
Yeah.
Quote unquote. All right. Let's turn to Susan mentioned that in Taiwan here we have extensive government price control. Are these justifiable measures under progressive capitalism? Should we be more cautious about expanding the role of government?
Well, I think one should always be cautious, whatever you do, but I think most economists would agree with Susan that there are real dangers of intervention in pricing, that you should be wary. That I think is a precept. But at the same time, there are certain circumstances when price intervention is desirable, and then there are some circumstances where it's important. Well, let me explain some of the circumstances where price intervention is desirable. One example is life-saving drugs, where the cost of production is, say, $100, and you have a monopoly, and it's charging $5,000, and 50 times the cost. And the result of that is people die. As a society, we can say, well, we don't like to intervene in the market, but saving people's lives is more important than pricing. During COVID-19, we allowed Pfizer and Moderna effectively to price themselves out of the market for developing countries. And we allowed them to hoard their intellectual property so that people in the third world could not get access to the vaccines. And thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people died as a result of that. I think that was a mistake, that we should have intervened. And 100 countries thought that. And there are only 3 countries in the world that said that we shouldn't intervene. But they were strong enough to stop that, and people died as a result. So, you know, that's one example. Most societies say that when you have extreme weather event, you can't allow price gouging. So in Louisiana, we had the Hurricane Katrina, and there were people charging huge prices for water. And again, do you want the price system to work, or do you want some minimal sense of, you know, of fairness? Some people live and some people die. Okay, so price gouging is another example. Now, let me go back to New York, where our recently elected Mayor Madani, who I think is great, proposed housing price rent controls. Now, he hasn't quite articulated this as I'm going to do it, but I think this is the argument I'm trying to get him to say, that once you move into an apartment, your landlord has a lot of market power over you because the cost of moving is very high. You have to move your children, you have to move to schools, so the bargaining power has suddenly changed. The bargaining power between the ordinary renter and the landlord is where there is unfair market power on the part of the landlord. So what you should have is something we do have, but have stronger rent stabilization. You can't raise the rent more than can be justified by the cost by too much. So you can raise the rent 5 or 10% a year, but not by 50%. You know, unless something happens to inflation. So you have some degree of protection of individuals. Now let me give one more example, because it's one that's very live right now in many countries, and it's related to digital transactions. As you know, there are, in the United States, and I think it's true in most of the world, three companies dominate digital transactions: Visa, MasterCard, and American Express. They're monopolies. They charge exorbitant, you know, how much does it take to move the electrons that say transfer money from my bank account to your bank account when I go to a store and buy? How much does it cost? A fraction of a penny. How much do they charge? Well, 2, 3, 4% of the cost, generating tens of billions of dollars that are a cost to small businesses. Particularly, Walmart can negotiate lower prices, but a small business can't. It's really exploitation of market power. So the first best solution is to try to make the market more competitive. And we've been trying for that. I've been involved in litigation on that as an expert witness for almost 20 years. And the justice system moves very slowly. So in that context, does it make sense to say they cannot charge more than 10 times the cost? That's not, or 5 times the cost. That's a price control, but it is efficiency enhancing. So those are examples where it seems to me, both on equity and efficiency, some degrees of price controls may be desirable.
Susan, you have something to say.
Yes, hello. It's on. I just want to clarify, I'm not against all the price controls. So I want to just give an example of good price control in Taiwan, which is our national health insurance. Yes. Okay. So exactly because the coercion that forces everybody to participate in this risk pooling program, people are able to afford many very expensive drugs and to save their lives. So I just want to make clear that I'm not against all the price controls. The examples I gave just to illustrate that there's a dangerous line. Yeah.
No, I think, and having good academics criticize that is really important so that the government will change its policies.
The view represented myself, not Academia Sinica, just to clarify.
Yes, Hank.
Yes, I also have a question for Professor Stiglitz. I can tell you're very persistent, involved in this 20 years, and still just move very slowly. But I have a question. You mentioned the government need to intervene during the COVID-19. But if people criticize, in terms of the talent, patent innovations, royalties, the monopoly is the #1 to generate those patents. University and research institute is #2. The talent's probably only #3. So without those high prices, who is going to innovate those patents and generate those applications?
Yeah, so obviously you need ways of generating returns to investment in innovation. I think that there are a whole variety of ways of, first, the most important sources of innovation in our society is basic research, which no private sector or few private sectors are going to support. I mentioned before the basic mRNA platform, and before that it was the DNA. That was basic research that governments in general do not finance. A few examples where I work for Bell Labs. There are a few examples of private companies that have done some basic research, but it's really a small fraction of the basic research. That we have to look to government to do. And that is where collective action is important. Bringing what's sometimes called the last mile, using that basic research to produce a product, the private sector has a more important role. But even in the case of the mRNA COVID-19 vaccine, more than 90% of that last mile was financed by the government. Moderna and Pfizer put in a relatively small fraction of the cost. But there are several different ways of financing that. One, as in the case of COVID-19, government. A second one is a prize fund. A patent is a prize, but it's a very inefficient prize. It's a prize that takes the form of giving the right to being a monopolist. And there are other forms of prizes that are better for particular kinds of, that doesn't work in every case, but works for many of the health products. So for instance, what you would do is to announce that anybody that discovered a vaccine for some disease would get $1 billion. But then make that vaccine available to a competitive market with a royalty so that they don't charge the monopoly price. So you use the force of competition to distribute it, but you use a prize system to provide the incentive for research. We've mix the two together in a way that's very inefficient. In the United States, I worked with Bernie Sanders to introduce legislation, to introduce this prize system. The WHO has had discussions on this prize system. It hasn't yet been adopted, but in the 19th century, there were some really interesting examples where that was actually used, the prize system, and there have been in some cases, even in the United States, where it's been used. A big issue in the 19th century was chimney sweeps. I don't know if you know chimney sweeps? No? Well, so they used to burn coal to heat in England, okay? It was a very cold country, okay? So you burn coal. Now, the problem with coal is it's very bad for the environment, but it also generates soot, you know, carbon, that gets deposited on the chimney. Now, the problem with the deposit of carbon on the chimney is if there's a spark, it can light the carbon and the house burns down. So that's not a good thing. So they used to take children, small boys, and put them down to the chimney, and they would sweep out the carbon. Now, that wasn't very, it was good for the house, but it was very bad for the children. So somebody in the 19th century in England said, we will give a prize for somebody who innovates to do a mechanical chimney sweep. And the prize was important because you wanted not to have it only rich people who could afford an expensive machine. You wanted, once you made the discovery, you wanted everybody to use it because you wanted nobody to be a chimney sweep. Yeah. And so they gave the prize, there was the innovation, and you saved the lives of the children and you saved the buildings. So that's an example of a prize that actually worked. And so it's an alternative to the patent system, which is a very inefficient way of providing the revenue for innovation. Most of the cases I mentioned, though, Pfizer and Moderna got returns that were zillion times larger than what they spent.
All right, Professor, we're running out of time, so probably I'll raise one last quick question. Since you talk about AI, I want to talk about AI industry here in Taiwan. So there is an issue from The Economist. The cover is called Taiwan Disease. Right? You're familiar with it? That caused huge sensation and discussion here in Taiwan. That argued the high tech-led export-driven growth supported by persistent exchange rate management has not produced broad prosperity. With the gains concentrated among tech and export elites, this has led to stagnant real wages and depressed purchasing power. So if you were our government advisor, would you advise our government, one, to adjust our industry structure, or strengthen public investment?
Well, let me say, I think the development strategy that Taiwan has had has been enormously successful. Yeah, so I think the state-led development model, working with the private sector, has been really a model for success. And I think the criticism of The Economist is misplaced.
Oh wow, misplaced.
So
you don't see that.
So,
But the growth is not included
Yes.
So, but it's not a complete story yet.
Okay.
So it has been successful in generating a very strong economy and overall growth, and you might say innovation, a leader in some sectors of the whole world. So that's clearly a positive that shouldn't be minimized. That's clearly a positive. The second thing that I think you underestimate is looking at wages or even disposable income isn't a good measure if you have good publicly provided health, education, infrastructure. There are many aspects of life. You know, we spend 20% of our income in America on health care, and we get results that are terrible. Life expectancy that is actually going down, and you know, so it's the point is having you can't look at just incomes alone. You want to look at standards of living more broadly. Now, that doesn't stop me saying there are some more things you ought to be doing. That there is greater inequality, not anywhere near as bad as the United States. But clearly it's a concern. So what would I do? Well, one of the things that comes out of the you should say the Taiwan disease or whatever is low interest rates have led to high property values that make it young people difficult for them to get housing. It's true also in the United States, true in many other countries, each for different reasons. One of the things is I believe very strongly in land taxes and capital gains taxes. Most economists think that the big advantages of land taxes is that when you tax land, it doesn't leave the country. You know, if you tax capital, it might leave. You tax workers, they might leave. But land is not going to leave. And that's true of natural resources. They're an inherent part of the country. So in the 19th century in the United States, the progressive movement, Henry George was at the center of that movement, and he argued for a very high land tax. So I think real estate taxes and using the revenues of the real estate taxes that would get the real estate prices down and would give use that revenue to make housing more available. Some other societies like Vienna, a very large fraction of the housing stock is publicly provided, and it does it very well, very efficiently, better than the private sector. And thinking about, you know, different societies have different capacities. They've succeeded in doing that. It's a little bit of a miracle, but so Taiwan could do that too, I think.
I hear you, Professor. We're not doing so bad. Yeah. Actually, we're actually
but there are
good.
more things that you can do to try to create a more, you say, inclusive, just society. So, but build on what your successes are, not take away from those successes.
Thank you. That's the confidence and direction that we need. Thank you so much, Professor. That's a wrap. 谢谢我的两位 panelists， 谢谢你们今天非常精彩的分享 ，and thank you so much again for coming here。再次掌声，谢谢我的嘉宾。Would you please stand up? Thank you, thank you so much。今天我们的活动就到这边告一段落了，也非常感谢今天3位讲者。那在大家离开之前，可不可以花一点点时间，邀请大家可以扫描荧幕上面的 QR code， 可不可以给我你们宝贵的建议？下一次我们会更准备的更好，跟大家见面。今天也再次谢谢大家的出席，我是陆怡珍，我们下次再见，大家拜拜。